Welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week, Sam breaks down the highest yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics with your host, Sam Smith. The goal of this podcast is to cover the highest yield topics on the MCAT and provide you with some sort of insight into the questions that the MCAT really likes to ask. This podcast is going to cover sound and hearing. First, I'm going to talk about some physics, and I'm going to go into sound waves. I'll talk about pitch. I'll talk about ultrasound, and then lastly, I'll get into the decibel system. And then second, I'm going to get into some physiology. So I'll talk about how our ears are able to take these sound waves and convert them into electrical impulses that can be sent to the brain that enable us to hear a bunch of different sounds, including this podcast. And this material is going to show up on 2 of the 4 MCAT sections. That's going to be the biochem section, as well as the physics-chemistry section. So I hope you find this podcast helpful. I think it's a pretty interesting topic, and also something that you might see show up on test day. As I said in the intro, the first thing I want to talk about here is the physics of sound. And I'll start by talking about sound waves. So sound waves are quite a bit different than light waves. And one of the things that makes them different is the fact that light waves are considered transverse waves, whereas sound waves are considered longitudinal waves. And the difference between these two types of waves is something that I think is important to understand. So in a transverse wave, like a light wave, displacement of the wave moves perpendicular to the particles in that wave as they travel through some medium. Whereas in a longitudinal wave, which would be something like a sound wave, the displacement of the wave is in the same direction as the bulk movement of particles in that medium. And I think one of the best ways to visually see the difference between these two waves is through kind of the classic physics demonstration that you may have seen in like high school physics, where you take a slinky and you push the very front of that slinky and you see a wave propagate through the length of that slinky. And you can see that the bits of the slinky that are moving and kind of propagating this wave are moving in the same direction as that wave down the whole length of the slinky. And that's a longitudinal wave. A transverse wave, on the other hand, is something where like you tie a rope to a desk or a table or something, and then you whip the rope up and you'll see that wave kind of propagate across, hit the table, come back and bounce back at you. And if you were to look at a point on that rope, you'd see that as the wave travels lengthwise through that rope, the piece of that rope actually travels up as the wave hits it, and then it goes back down. So you have displacement of that little part of the rope in the opposite direction as the net movement of that wave, and that is going to be a transverse wave. And these are very Googleable, YouTubeable demonstrations, so if what I just said doesn't make much sense, just go ahead and type that into YouTube real fast and you can see it in live action. So as I said, sound waves are longitudinal waves, and at their most basic level, they are variations in pressure that travel as waves through the atmosphere. And again, you can think about these sound waves as like slinkies traveling through the air. There's going to be areas in these waves where the slinky is more compact, and that's going to correspond to a region of high pressure. And this region on a sound wave is called a compression. And then there's also regions of decreased pressure where the slinkies kind of spread apart, and those are called rarefactions. And so, for instance, what you're doing when you're talking and producing words and sounds and stuff is you're creating local changes in pressure that then travel as waves through the atmosphere, and then those waves are picked up by the ear, and then people can hear you, say words or make noises or whatever you're doing with your mouth. And I think an important point here is that sound waves need a medium that has some kind of mass to it, or some kind of particles that have mass to it in order to propagate. Think about the atmosphere. You have all these gas particles that are floating around that are able to kind of carry these differences in pressure around as waves. If you're somewhere where there is no atmosphere, like say space, then these sound waves can't travel. So, if an astronaut was trying to talk in space with no spacesuit on, well, they'd be dead. But if they were trying to talk, nobody would hear them. They could be screaming and nobody would hear them because these sound waves can't travel in a vacuum. And this is in direct contrast to light. As we know, light can act as a particle and as a wave. It's the particle-wave duality. But these particles of light are called photons, and photons don't have mass. They don't need a medium with mass in order to propagate, right? They can propagate from the sun to the earth easily and throughout the rest of space. They don't need like a medium with mass in order to travel around. So that's one place where sound waves and light waves are different, but sound waves and light waves do share some of the same properties. Sound waves and light waves both have amplitude, wavelength, and frequency. Amplitude is the maximum displacement of a wave. In terms of a slinky, this would essentially be how big the slinky is. And in terms of sound itself, the amplitude would correspond to how loud a sound wave is perceived to be. So if it had a high amplitude, it would be perceived to be very loud. If it had a low amplitude, it would be perceived to be a softer noise or less loud. Wavelength and frequency are both connected terms, and they're both connected by a singular equation that you for sure should have memorized, and that's that the speed of a wave is equal to the wavelength of that wave times the frequency of that wave, or speed equals wavelength times frequency. And I'll get into the speed of sound in a second. It's essentially just dependent upon the medium that it's traveling through. But the wavelength and the frequency of a sound wave correspond to the perceived pitch of the sound. So a very low sound like has a large wavelength and low frequency. On the other hand, a high-pitched sound like has a small wavelength and a large frequency. Shout out singer-songwriter Sam Smith. Which if you want to hear a really high-pitched sound, go listen to some of his music. I mean, it's just insane the notes he can hit, and a very good singer. Unfortunately, I'm only Sam Smith, the podcaster, but that dude can sing. But anyway, so I think it's important here to notice that these two values, wavelength and frequency, are kind of inversely related when we talk about noises. And I guess when we talk about light too. And that's because the speed of sound in a medium can be assumed to be pretty much constant. So that means that wavelength times frequency must be constant. So if, for instance, I have a sound wave with low wavelength, that means it must have a higher frequency. Whereas if I have a sound wave with high wavelength, it must have low frequency. And again, this is because wavelength times frequency must be equal to a constant in a particular medium. All right, now let's get into the speed of sound. So as I said, the speed of sound is dependent upon the medium that the sound wave travels through. And when I say medium, all I'm talking about is the substance that carries this sound wave. So it could be anything from water to a solid, like say a brick, to air in the atmosphere. And there's an equation that describes the speed of sound. And this is that the speed of sound is equal to the square root of k divided by rho. And in this equation, K is equal to the bulk modulus of whatever medium we're talking about. And bulk modulus is simply a measure of how resistant to compression a specific substance is. And then rho, of course, is density. So the speed of sound is equal to the square root of bulk modulus over density of the medium in which the wave is propagating through. And to me, this equation is not one that I would memorize. I just kind of know what this means for sound waves and essentially how the speed of sound changes through different mediums depending upon their state of matter. And to help you kind of see what I mean by this, I'm going to break down this equation a little bit. So again, we have the speed of sound is equal to the square root of bulk modulus over density. So let's talk first about the numerator, which is the bulk modulus. So bulk modulus, again, is a measure of how resistant to compression a substance is. So this value is much higher for solids than for liquids, and is much higher for liquids than gases. So you could imagine then that the numerator is the biggest for solids and least for gases. Now, density in the denominator trends kind of the same way, right? So for solids, they tend to have a greater density than liquids, and liquids tend to have a greater density than gases. And so now what I'm sure you're thinking is, okay, what drives this difference in the speed of sound depending upon the state of matter that I'm traveling through? Because as you said, both the numerator and denominator are both trending in the same direction for each state of matter. For instance, solids have the greatest bulk modulus in general, as well as the greatest density in general. So, when you have two big numbers divided by each other, it's they're going to even each other out. And so what you need to know essentially is that bulk modulus is essentially the driver of this equation. And so when you look at the speed of sound through different materials, you see that speed travels fastest through solids, second fastest through liquids, and then slowest in gases. However, density still does play a role in determining the speed of sound through a medium. So if you take, for instance, two materials, say aluminum and gold, that have very similar bulk moduluses, you'll see that sound actually travels about twice as fast in the aluminum as in the gold. And this is because aluminum is less dense than gold. So just keep that in mind, that when you're looking at two materials with very similar bulk moduluses, that's typically going to be comparing a solid to a solid, or a liquid to a liquid, or a gas to a gas. Then density comes into play, and the lower the density, the higher the speed of sound in that medium. So I think the overall takeaway for the MCAT is that speed of sound travels fastest through solids, and that the lower the density of a medium, the faster sound is going to travel through that medium. Sound waves and the speed of sound apply to another pretty high yield concept on the MCAT, and that is the concept of ultrasound imaging. Ultrasound imaging uses sound waves to produce images of structures inside of the body. Probably the most well-known example, or at least what comes to my mind when I think of ultrasound, is images of babies in a mother's womb. But of course, there's a lot of other things physicians use these for, and I think it's important to have a kind of a conceptual understanding of how ultrasounds operate for the MCAT, so I'm going to go through that. So sound can be produced at an unlimited amount of frequencies. As you could imagine, you could have a frequency very close to zero, you could have a frequency very close to infinity, and anything in between. This is a continuous variable. However, there's only a strict range that we humans can hear, and the range is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And that's a pretty tight window of what we can hear between, right? There's frequencies on either side of that range, that go way out far. And I'm sure there's some kind of evolutionary reason behind why we can only hear within that certain range. Maybe that corresponds to the range that humans' vocal cords can produce. I don't really know, but that's the range. And I would actually know those numbers, 20 hertz to 20,000 kilohertz. And so ultrasound is at a frequency that is above what we can hear. For example, diagnostic radiology ultrasounds range from approximately 2 megahertz to approximately 15 megahertz, which is about 1,000 times above the frequency that we can hear. And so what happens when a physician or a nurse or an ultrasound tech is using this ultrasound is they will shoot pulsed or continuous ultrasound waves into the part of the body that they want to image. And you could imagine continuous waves essentially just being like zzz, and pulse waves being like zzz, 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 where they're shooting and kind of pulsating these waves. And then what happens is these sound waves actually reflect off of the structures that are kind of deep into the body that you want to image, and they're returned to the ultrasound device. And that's called reflection of a wave. And essentially, this ultrasound is able to kind of listen for these reflected waves and then produce an electrical signal in response to these reflected waves that it listens to. And then it can transmit that electrical signal to a computer, which can then produce an image. And what's interesting to me is that these ultrasound devices actually use these little crystals to produce the sound waves, as well as read the reflected sound waves coming back. So I don't really know exactly how that happens. It seems like a bit of magic to me. I'm sure some of you who are listening in like Southern California who know a bit more about magic healing crystals than I do, might be able to have some input there. All jokes aside, one of my friends who actually lives in LA was telling me that they know about like a few crystal healing shops that are actually set up, and I never heard of that. So now I'm just associating everything healing, crystal, voodoo, magic healing with California. The next thing I want to talk about here is the decibel system. So this is how we look at how loud a sound is. And it's an interesting scale, so I think it's something that's worth going over and knowing for the MCAT. So the decibel system is a way to measure the intensity of sound. And then intensity correlates to the loudness of a sound. And it's abbreviated lowercase d, capital B. And the most important thing to understand here, as I kind of mentioned, is how the scale of the decibel system works. Because it's not like a normal scale. It's actually a log-based scale. The equation that describes the intensity of a sound in decibels is the intensity in decibels of a sound is equal to 10 times log base 10 of the intensity of a sound divided by the intensity of the threshold of hearing, or I naught. And as always with equations, I think what's important here is to really understand the ratios in this equation. And let me explain this using the following example. So say that I clap once and produce sound waves that are 10 times greater in terms of their intensity than the threshold of hearing. What would be the intensity of that clapping sound in decibels? If you use the equation, that would just be 10 times log base 10 of 10, right? Because I over I naught is 10 if I clapped 10 times louder than the threshold of hearing. So you do the math and you see that you produce sound with an intensity of 10 decibels. Now, let's say that I clap again, but this time I clap 20 times louder than the threshold of hearing. Now, what is the intensity of that sound in decibels? Do the math there and you see that you produce a sound that is 100 decibels. And then let's say that I clap at 30 times the threshold of hearing, and you'll see that you produce a sound that's 1,000 decibels. So you can start to see the pattern here, that for each doubling of intensity of sound that I produce in my clapping, that's going to be a 10x increase in the decibel level. One way to actually see this visually, and what really helped me kind of see this, was I just took Excel and I plotted this function, this decibel function, and I was able to kind of see visually how the intensity of a sound correlates to its intensity in decibels. And I think that's something that really helps you see that. So if you want to do that, do it. Another type of question you might see, or kind of question to understand, is if the MCAT were to ask you, how much louder is a 40 decibel sound than the threshold of hearing, which is essentially asking the same thing that I just talked about, but in reverse order. And here, the answer is 10 to the fourth, or 10,000 times louder. So just understand how to kind of use that equation, play around with it. I know it's probably hard to kind of see when you're listening to this podcast, so if you need to do some work, use it, understand how to use it.
Thanks for checking out the Prospective Doctor MCAT Basics podcast. Sam's doing a killer job taking you through the most important MCAT topics, but what if you need a little extra help? How does a 5, 10, or even 15-point increase in your score sound? Imagine how your chances at admission could increase. Med School Coach's MCAT tutoring can get you there. With the most rigorous selection process of any tutoring company, we see amazing results. We deconstruct each student, find a plan that is going to work, and help execute it. That's why our students add an average 12 points to their score. Completely physician-run and operated, and focusing on nothing but medicine. It's no wonder over 10,000 past students have trusted Med School Coach to get them through the MCAT and into medical school. Check out medschoolcoach.com today and mention code PODCAST for 5% off.
All right, now for the interesting part of the podcast. I want to talk about how we're actually able to sense these sound waves, which are just basically pressure variations in the air, and turn these into signals that can then be sent to the brain and processed and then understood as language, understood as, scary sounds that I should be afraid of. Whatever it may be, we can understand these minute variations in pressure in the air. So before I get into the physiology, I kind of want to give a general overview of some of the anatomy of the ear. So the ear is broken down into 3 different substructures. You have the outer ear, you have the middle ear, and you have the inner ear. The outer ear is the part of the ear that we can actually see. When someone says that I have big ears, this is the part of the ear that they're talking about. And the outer ear is composed of cartilage, and essentially it functions to funnel sound into the ear. And the outer ear has a bunch of structures within it, things like the auricle, the antihelix, the helix, and it also includes the ear canal. And I don't think these are necessarily important to know for the MCAT. I think you should just understand that the outer ear is basically a funnel that kind of focuses the sound that's around us towards the ear canal and into the eardrum. And the eardrum is actually the divider between the outer ear and the middle ear. Now, the middle ear is an air-filled space that transmits sound from the outer ear to the inner ear. And it contains 3 ossicles, which are just these tiny little bones that transfer vibrations from the eardrum into the inner ear. And these 3 bones are called the malleus, incus, and stapes. And that's actually their order from the eardrum to the inner ear. In other words, the malleus is connected to the eardrum on one side, and then on the other side, it's connected to the incus, and then the incus is connected to the stapes, and the stapes is connected to the inner ear. And specifically, it's connected to the fenestra ovalis, which is also called the oval window. And as I'll get into in a sec, part of what these little bones do is they actually amplify the sound waves that hit the eardrum. So they play an important role in amplification of these sound waves. And last but definitely not least is the inner ear. And the inner ear is a space composed of a component called the bony labyrinth, which inside of the bony labyrinth, there is another structure that's called the membranous labyrinth. And I'm guessing that these structures are called labyrinths because they're kind of shaped funny. And if you were to be trapped inside, which this is going to sound a little bit like an episode of The Magic School Bus, if you remember that. If you were trapped inside that structure, it would look like this twisty, turny labyrinth that would be really difficult to find your way out of. Anyway, there are two main components in the inner ear that collectively make up this labyrinth. The first being the vestibular system, and the second being the cochlea. The vestibular system is a 3-ring structure in which each of these rings is called a semicircular canal, and they are involved in balance. And each of these 3 rings is normal to each other. It's like an X, Y, and a Z axis. And these kind of help you in your balance, right? It kind of can tell, it helps you tell where you're at in 3-dimensional space, which is kind of cool. The cochlea, on the other hand, is involved in transducing sound into electrical signals that can then be sent to the brain. And the cochlea kind of looks like a snail's shell. It's got this spiraling shape. I mean, actually, in fact, the word cochlea is derived from the Greek word for spiral, cochleus. And the cochlea has a few important structures within it that you will see come up when I talk more about the physiology of hearing and of the ear. And those components are endolymph, the organ of Corti, and the basilar membrane. So let's start with endolymph. So endolymph is just a fluid that fills the cochlea. It's pretty easy. The basilar membrane is the fibrous membrane that supports the organ of Corti. And both the organ of Corti and the basilar membrane are kind of wrapped up into the spiral. So it would be like if a snail went all the way into its shell and kind of like stretched all the way around in that spiral shape. So both of those fill up the whole of the cochlea as it spirals around. And so again, the basilar membrane is the support for the organ of Corti, and the organ of Corti has specialized sensory epithelium on it that allows for the transduction of sound into neural signals. In other words, it's the layer of cells that directly transduces sound to neural signals. And these cells that make up the organ of Corti are called hair cells, and they have these little protrusions that come out of them. They look like hairs, they're not actually hair. They're made up of actin. And just to illustrate this point that the basilar membrane and the organ of Corti are kind of rolled up into the cochlea, is that if you were to take them out of the cochlea and unroll them, you'd see that they are approximately 32 millimeters in length, which is about 1.25 inches, which is pretty big to imagine being like inside of your ear in the inner ear. It's a fairly big thing. And so from a bird's eye point of view, the outer ear funnels sound into the eardrum. The middle ear transmits that sound to the inner ear while amplifying it. And then the inner ear transduces that sound to electrical nerve impulses. So let's talk about more in detail of how that process works. So just sit back and imagine that you're talking to your friend, and your friend is creating these little local changes in pressure around their mouth, and those local changes in pressure are getting carried as waves that propagate all around, and these waves eventually make it to your ear. And the first thing that's going to happen, and I've said this, is that your outer ear is going to funnel that sound into your ear canal and kind of focus it on your eardrum. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to vibrate your eardrum. And of course, you have 3 small bones that are all attached to each other that are also attached to your eardrum. So these are called ossicles, and they are actually going to vibrate as well as your eardrum vibrates. And they're actually going to amplify the sound waves. And according to Moore in Daly's Clinical Oriented Anatomy 4th edition book, these bones amplify the sound waves by about 10 times. And I started to do some research into how exactly these three little bones are able to amplify sound by that much. And it turns out it's actually pretty complicated. Has to do with mechanical advantage, lots of physics-y shit. So I thought you probably don't need to know that for the MCAT, so I'm not going to go into that here. Just kind of understand that these bones all vibrate along with your eardrum as these sound waves come into your middle ear. And now, the stapes, as I said, is connected to the oval window, which is the connection between the middle ear and the inner ear. And of course, as this stapes vibrates along with the other bones, it's going to vibrate that oval window. So here's where this process, I think, gets pretty interesting. So I'm going to talk now about the inner ear, and I'm mostly going to talk about the cochlea because that's what's mainly involved in hearing. As I said, the vestibular system is involved with balance, coordination, and like three-dimensional space. So again, the oval window is this part that connects the inner ear to the middle ear, and it sits right on the side of the cochlea. And as this oval window vibrates, it pulls and pushes on fluid that fills the cochlea. And this fluid, again, is called endolymph. And what this does is it causes the fluid to kind of move back and forth. And I imagine it kind of like fluid sloshing around in a boat as it's like sinking. You know, it's like ploof, 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 if you could imagine that. And so as this endolymph is moving around, because of the movement of this oval window, this causes the basilar membrane to move. And of course, what sits right on top the basilar membrane? Well, that's the organ of Corti, or Corti, or Corgi, whatever you want to call it. And the organ of Corti is made up of these hair cells. And these hair cells begin to move along with the basilar membrane as it moves. And in turn, what this causes is the hairs on the hair cell to move. They kind of sway back and forth depending upon the movement of this basilar membrane. And the swaying of these hairs to one side actually opens up these ion channels, which then leads to influx of potassium ions, I believe, yes, potassium ions, which then cause that cell to depolarize and eventually lead to the firing of an action potential, which then produces a signal that goes all the way up to the brain. And I think one important thing to understand is how different parts of the basilar membrane correspond to different frequency of sounds. Let me explain what I mean by that. So the basilar membrane is very stiff and narrow kind of at the start of the cochlea. And as you travel up that basilar membrane and like into the cochlea, it becomes more wide and more floppy. And because of this difference in mechanical properties as you travel up the basilar membrane, it kind of vibrates at different locations based upon the frequency of sound that you're hearing come from your friend's mouth. And I'm not sure exactly the mechanism by which this works, if it's like kind of a resonance thing or what it is, but you can kind of imagine that different points in the basilar membrane correspond to different or distinct frequencies of sound. So for instance, at the base of the basilar membrane, which is kind of at the start of the cochlea, again, this is where it is thin and stiff. That's where you're going to hear a lot of your very high frequency noises, up to about 20,000 hertz. And then way down at the apex, which is on the other side, all the way down into the cochlea, you're going to hear your low frequency sounds stopping right around 20 hertz. All right, so that's kind of a brief foray into the physiology of hearing. If you want to know more, I think there's some pretty good Khan Academy videos. I wouldn't say this is a super high yield topic, but it's definitely something that you should know if you want to be a top scorer on the MCAT. As always, thanks for listening to this episode. If you ever have any suggestions for future episodes or, you're studying and you see some concept keep coming up that I haven't covered, feel free to leave it in the reviews. I saw someone leave one on fluids the other day, and actually I was working on an episode for fluids before that review was even posted. But if you want to see something, leave a comment on a review. I always read those. And so if I think it's something that is good to cover or I haven't done yet, then I'd definitely be open to doing that.
Thanks for listening to Prospective Doctor's MCAT podcast. If you're a pre-med, you'll want to check out prospectivedoctor.com for tons of free tools, articles, and more podcasts that cover your pre-med life. And if you need help on the MCAT or getting into med school, check out medschoolcoach.com for the experts.